Thanksgiving has always been a big deal in my family. Every year, we'd gather at my parents' house. Everyone from my siblings to distant cousins would show up. It was loud, chaotic, and filled with the kind of food that could knock you into a coma. This year was supposed to be no different. At least that's what I thought. I arrived with my wife, Emily, a little later than usual. She had spent extra time getting ready, which wasn't uncommon for her. She always wanted to look her best, especially at family events. I didn't mind. I figured it was just one of those little things she cared about, and I never gave it much thought. The evening started off normally enough. My mom was in the kitchen, barking orders at anyone within earshot. My dad was on the porch, showing off his new smoker to anyone who'd listen. And my siblings were scattered around the living room, debating football scores and politics. Emily slipped away almost immediately, saying she was going to help Mom in the kitchen. Again, nothing unusual. As the night went on, I started to notice things I couldn't quite explain. Emily seemed different, distracted. She wasn't laughing at my dad's bad jokes like she usually did, and she barely touched her plate at dinner. At one point, I caught her glancing at her phone under the table. She quickly put it away when she noticed me looking, but something about the way she did it set off alarm bells. I tried to shake it off. Maybe she was tired. Maybe work had been stressful. But as the night wore on, the feeling in my gut only got worse. After dinner, the family gathered in the living room to share what we were thankful for. It was a tradition my mom insisted on every year, no matter how much we groaned about it. Emily sat next to me, but her body language was all wrong. She was fidgety, her leg bouncing nervously, and she kept looking toward the hallway where the guest rooms were. That's when I noticed something strange. My brother-in-law, Greg, was acting just as restless as Emily. He and Emily weren't particularly close, but that night, there was a weird tension between them. They avoided eye contact, and whenever one of them moved, the other seemed to follow with their gaze. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the thought planted itself in my mind and wouldn't leave. After the gratitude circle ended, Emily excused herself to grab something from the car. Greg got up shortly after, mumbling something about needing fresh air. My stomach sank. I didn't want to believe what my instincts were telling me, but I couldn't sit there and do nothing. I waited a few minutes, then quietly slipped out the back door. The cool night air hit me like a slap, but it did nothing to calm my nerves. I walked around the side of the house, toward the driveway, and that's when I saw them. Emily and Greg were standing near her car, talking in hushed tones. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the way they stood, too close, too familiar, told me everything I needed to know. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I considered walking away, pretending I hadn't seen anything. But then Greg reached out and touched her arm, and she didn't pull away. Something inside me snapped. I stepped out of the shadows, my voice steady but cold. Am I interrupting something? They both jumped, their faces going pale. Emily stammered something incoherent, while Greg looked like a deer caught in headlights. I didn't wait for their excuses. Save it, I said, my voice louder now. I'm done. Without another word, I turned and walked back inside. The warmth of the house felt suffocating now, the laughter and chatter of my family like nails on a chalkboard. I grabbed my coat, ignoring my mom's questions as I headed for the door. As I walked out, Emily ran after me. Mark, wait, she called, her voice desperate. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. That was the last time I saw her that night. The phone calls started the next morning. My mom, my siblings, even Emily, they all wanted to know what had happened, why I had stormed out of Thanksgiving dinner. But I couldn't bring myself to answer. How could I explain that the woman I thought I knew had betrayed me in the most gut-wrenching way? Now, here I am, sitting in the wreckage of what was supposed to be my perfect life, trying to make sense of it all. And the worst part? I know the story isn't over yet. The morning after Thanksgiving, the weight of what I had seen the night before hit me like a freight train. I woke up on the couch in the apartment, still wearing the same clothes from the night before. Emily's calls had started early, her name lighting up my phone over and over again. I didn't answer, couldn't. It wasn't just her, either. My mom had called 3 times, my dad twice, and even my sister left me a string of texts asking why I had left so suddenly. They didn't know the truth yet. How could they? I sat there staring at my phone, debating whether to respond or throw it across the room. The image of Emily and Greg standing by her car, so close, so intimate, played on repeat in my mind. My stomach twisted every time I thought about it. Eventually, I worked up the courage to call my mom back. Her voice was concerned but cheerful, as if she thought whatever had happened could be easily smoothed over. "Mark, honey, what's going on? You just left without a word last night. Everyone's been worried." I hesitated, my throat tightening. "It's complicated, Mom." "Complicated? What does that mean? Did something happen with Emily?" Her question was like a punch to the gut. Did something happen? How could I even begin to explain it? "Look," I said finally, "I just need some space right now. Please don't push me." She sighed but didn't press further. "All right, honey, but you know your dad and I are here if you need to talk. We love you." "Thanks, Mom," I muttered before hanging up. The rest of the day was a blur. I couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything. Emily kept calling, leaving voicemails that alternated between apologetic and defensive. "Mark, please just let me explain," one voicemail said. Another one, just hours later, was sharper. "You're not even giving me a chance to talk. This is ridiculous." Each one made my blood boil more than the last. Explain what? What could she possibly say to justify what I'd seen? By the evening, I decided I couldn't sit around drowning in my own thoughts anymore. I needed answers. I grabbed my keys and drove aimlessly for a while, letting the cold November air clear my head. Finally, I found myself parked outside my sister's house. She was the one person I trusted to give me honest advice, no matter how harsh it might be. When she opened the door and saw me standing there, her expression shifted from surprise to concern. "Mark, what's going on? You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't," I admitted, stepping inside. She made us coffee, and we sat in her living room while I told her everything. The tension I'd noticed at dinner, the moment I saw Emily and Greg together, the way they'd both looked at me like guilty kids caught stealing candy. Her face darkened as she listened. "Greg, are you serious?" I nodded. "I don't know how long it's been going on, but it was obvious last night. They didn't even try to deny it." She shook her head, anger flashing in her eyes. "I can't believe this. Emily and Greg? That's disgusting." "Yeah," I said bitterly. "Tell me about it." She leaned back, crossing her arms. "So, what are you going to do?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I haven't even spoken to Emily since last night. I don't know if I can." "Well, you need to figure it out," she said firmly. "You can't let this hang over you forever. Either she explains herself or you decide you're done. But sitting in limbo isn't going to help." I knew she was right. As much as I hated the idea of confronting Emily, I couldn't avoid it forever. I needed closure one way or another. When I got back home that night, Emily's car was in the driveway. My stomach churned as I parked and sat in the car, staring at the front door. She was inside, waiting. I knew this was going to be one of the hardest conversations of my life. Taking a deep breath, I opened the car door and stepped out. The house was quiet as I walked inside, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Emily was sitting on the couch, her arms crossed, her face a mix of guilt and defiance. She looked up as I entered, but I didn't say a word. I just stood there, staring at her, trying to keep my emotions in check. "I'm glad you're here," she said softly, breaking the silence. "We need to talk." I didn't move. "Talk about what, Emily? About you sneaking off with Greg? About the way you two were acting like I don't even exist?" Her face twisted, a mix of shame and frustration. "Mark, it's not what you think." "Don't," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. "Don't insult me by pretending I didn't see what I saw." She stood up, her hands trembling. "Please, just let me explain. It's not serious." I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow. "Not serious? You were sneaking around behind my back with my brother-in-law, Emily. How long has this been going on? Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked away, her silence louder than any confession. I took a step closer, my anger boiling over. How long? I repeated, my voice rising. 6 months, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. 6 months. Half a year of lies, of deceit, of sitting across from me at the dinner table and pretending everything was fine. Why? I asked, my voice trembling. What did I do to deserve this? Was I not enough for you? Did I not try hard enough? She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't about you, Mark. It was a mistake. I got caught up in something, and I didn't know how to stop. A mistake, I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. A mistake is forgetting to turn off the lights. A mistake isn't carrying on an affair for 6 months. Her tears came harder now, and she sank back onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. I'm sorry, she sobbed. I'm so sorry. But her apology felt hollow, like it was more for her benefit than mine. I paced the room, my mind racing. Did he mean anything to you? I asked finally, my voice quieter now. She hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. I nodded, a bitter smile tugging at my lips. I see. So, I'm just the guy who didn't measure up. That's not true, she cried, looking up at me with wide, desperate eyes. I love you, Mark. I do. I made a terrible mistake. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that this was just some terrible lapse in judgment, that we could fix this somehow. But the weight of her betrayal was too much. I need space, I said finally, my voice cold. I can't do this right now. Mark, please, she begged, standing up and reaching for me. Don't walk away. We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. I shook my head, stepping back. You should have thought about that 6 months ago. With that, I turned and walked out the door. The cool night air hit me like a wave, but it felt freeing somehow. I got into my car and drove without a destination, just needing to escape. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I ignored it. I couldn't face my family, couldn't face her, couldn't face anyone. All I knew was that this was the beginning of the end, and nothing would ever be the same. I drove aimlessly through the night, my mind a storm of emotions. Anger, sadness, betrayal. They all swirled together until I couldn't tell one from the other. The image of Emily crying on the couch haunted me, but so did the thought of her and Greg sneaking around behind my back. After an hour or so, I found myself parked at a lookout point overlooking the city. The lights below twinkled like stars, but I couldn't appreciate the view. My entire life felt like it had crumbled in a single night, and I didn't know where to go from here. My phone buzzed again. This time I checked it. There were more missed calls and texts from Emily, but what caught my eye was a message from my sister. Jessica, Mark, we need to talk. Call me when you can. I stared at the message, my chest tightening. She must have noticed something between Emily and Greg, or maybe Greg had said something to her. Either way, I needed answers, and she was the only person I trusted to give them to me straight. I dialed her number, and she picked up on the first ring. Mark, she said, her voice filled with concern. What's going on? Mom told me you left Thanksgiving early, and now Greg's acting weird. Did something happen? I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. I caught Emily and Greg together, outside, near her car. It was obvious. There was silence on the other end, and then Jessica let out a string of curses. That bastard, she hissed. I knew something was off with him lately. He's been acting so distant, but I never thought. Did you know? I asked, cutting her off. Did you have any idea this was happening? No, Mark, I swear, she said quickly. I had no clue. If I had, I would have told you. Her sincerity was clear, but it didn't make me feel any better. What do I do, Jess? I asked, my voice breaking. She says she loves me. But how can I believe that after everything? Jessica sighed. Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Emily messed up. Greg messed up. But you need to figure out what you want. Do you think you can forgive her? Can you even trust her again? I didn't have an answer. The truth was, I didn't know if I could ever look at Emily the same way. There's something else, Jessica said hesitantly. What? I overheard Greg on the phone last week, she admitted. He was talking to someone, I didn't know who at the time, but he said something about keeping things quiet. I didn't think much of it then, but now, my stomach churned. You think he was talking about Emily? I don't know, she said, but it wouldn't surprise me. Her words hung in the air like a dark cloud. If Greg had been trying to cover his tracks, it meant this wasn't just some spur-of-the-moment affair. It was calculated. I can't believe this, I muttered. My wife and my brother-in-law. How does this even happen? I'm so sorry, Mark, Jessica said softly. Whatever you decide to do, just know I'm here for you. Thanks, I said, my voice hollow. I'll figure it out. After we hung up, I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the city lights. The betrayal felt even deeper now, knowing that Greg had been hiding this from everyone, not just me. By the time I got home, it was past midnight. The house was dark, and Emily was nowhere to be seen. A note on the kitchen counter caught my eye. Mark, I'm staying at a hotel tonight to give you space. Please call me when you're ready to talk. I'm so sorry. Emily, I crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash. Space was the least of my concerns right now. What I needed was clarity, and that was going to take more than a few nights apart. As I climbed into bed, the silence of the house felt heavier than ever. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it finally did, my dreams were filled with fragments of memories. Some good, some bad, all of them tinged with the painful reality of what I had lost. But even in the darkness, one thought kept coming back to me. This wasn't over yet. The next morning, I woke up to a text from Jessica. Jessica, we need to talk. Greg just came by, and he's acting strange. Call me. I sat up, my heart pounding. Greg showing up at Jessica's place wasn't a good sign. What was he doing there? Trying to spin the story? Cover his tracks? I called her immediately, and she answered on the first ring. Mark, something's off, she said, her voice low and urgent. Greg came over this morning, and he's panicking. He said he wanted to explain everything to me before you blew it out of proportion. I gritted my teeth. Did he admit to anything? Not outright, she said. But he kept saying things like, it's not what it looks like, and Mark's just overreacting. It was so obvious he was lying. I clenched the phone tighter. Did you confront him? I tried, Jessica said, but he kept dodging my questions. Then he got defensive and left. Mark, I think he's scared you're going to tell everyone. Good, I said coldly. He should be. After hanging up, I paced the living room, my mind racing. If Greg was already scrambling to control the narrative, it meant he knew he was in deep. And if he thought I was just going to let this slide, he was dead wrong. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was Emily. Against my better judgment, I answered. Mark, she said, her voice shaking. Please, can we talk? Face to face. I don't know what there is to talk about, I said flatly. You've already done enough. Please, she begged. I know I messed up, but I need to explain. I owe you that much. I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to hear anything she had to say. But another part, the part that still wanted closure, agreed. Fine, I said after a long pause. But it's not going to change anything. Thank you, she said, relief flooding her voice. Can you meet me at the park? I'm there now. I agreed and hung up, grabbing my keys before I could change my mind. When I arrived at the park, Emily was sitting on a bench, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by nervous energy. I sat down across from her, keeping my distance. All right, I'm here. Talk. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she clasped them in her lap. Mark, I don't even know where to start. Start with the truth, I said sharply. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. It started 6 months ago. I didn't mean for it to happen, but Greg, He was there when I felt like you weren't. He made me feel seen. Her words felt like a slap in the face. Seen? Are you serious, Emily? I was right there with you the whole time. I know, she whispered. But things between us haven't been the same. You've been distant, focused on work, and I felt invisible. I shook my head, my anger boiling over. So your solution was to cheat on me with my brother-in-law? To sneak around behind my back and lie to me for months? She sobbed, covering her face with her hands. I wasn't thinking. I didn't mean to hurt you, Mark. I hate myself for what I've done. Do you? I asked, my voice cold. Because it seems like you're only sorry now that you've been caught. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. It wasn't supposed to go this far. I never meant to betray you like this. Then why did you? I demanded. She hesitated, and for a moment, I thought she might lie again. But then she said something that sent a chill down my spine. Because Greg told me he was in love with me, she admitted. And I didn't know how to handle it. I felt trapped and I didn't know how to stop. The world seemed to tilt around me. Greg had pursued her? He had confessed his feelings and dragged her into this mess? I stood up, unable to sit still any longer. So he manipulated you? Is that what you're saying? I don't know, she whispered. Maybe, but I still made my choices and I take full responsibility for them. I need you to know that I love you, Mark. I never stopped loving you. Her words rang hollow. How could she claim to love me after everything she'd done? I can't do this right now, I said, stepping back. I need time to think. Mark, please, she said, standing up and reaching for me. I shook my head. No, Emily, this is on you. You need to figure out what kind of person you want to be. And I need to decide if I can live with what you've done. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there in tears. As I drove home, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a betrayal of love, it was a betrayal of trust. And that was something I wasn't sure I could ever get back. The drive home was eerily quiet. I couldn't shake Emily's words from my mind. Her claim that Greg had confessed his love for her, that she felt trapped. It felt like I was caught in some twisted game where everyone I trusted had betrayed me. When I got home, I found myself scrolling through my phone, staring at the names of my family members in my contacts. They were all tangled up in this mess now, whether they knew it or not. I couldn't let this stay hidden any longer. I called Jessica first. Mark, she answered quickly. What happened? Did you talk to her? I did, I said, my voice heavy. She admitted everything. And she said Greg confessed his feelings for her months ago. Jessica let out a sharp breath. That son of a Mark, he's not getting away with this. He's torn apart our family. We need to tell Mom and Dad. The thought of telling my parents made my stomach churn. But Jessica was right. They deserved to know. We agreed to meet at my parents' house later that evening. Jessica would bring Greg and I'd come alone. I didn't tell Emily. I didn't want her there for this. When I arrived, the tension in the room was palpable. Greg sat on the couch, his arms crossed and his expression guarded. My parents looked confused, their eyes darting between me and Jessica as we stood by the door. What's going on? My mom asked, her voice tinged with worry. I took a deep breath and looked directly at Greg. Why don't you tell them, Greg? Or should I? He glared at me, his jaw tightening. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie, Jessica snapped. We all know what you've been doing. With Emily. My mom gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. My dad's face darkened, his fists clenching on the armrest of his chair. Is this true? My dad demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Greg looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting between all of us. Finally, he stood up, throwing his hands in the air. Fine. Yes, it's true. I made a mistake, all right? But it's not all on me. Emily. Don't. I cut him off, my voice trembling with anger. Don't you dare try to pin this on her. She's guilty too, but you. I pointed a finger at him, my hand shaking. You're my brother-in-law. You're supposed to be family. The room erupted into chaos. My mom was crying, Jessica was yelling at Greg, and my dad looked like he was seconds away from throwing a punch. I stood there, feeling like the ground was falling out from under me. Finally, my dad's voice cut through the noise. "Enough!" he barked, silencing everyone. He looked at Greg, his expression one of pure disappointment. "You're not welcome in this house anymore. Get out." Greg opened his mouth to argue but thought better of it. He grabbed his coat and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The room was quiet except for my mom's soft sobs. I sank into a chair, burying my face in my hands. "Mark," my dad said after a moment. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea." I nodded but didn't say anything. What could I say? My family was shattered, and I didn't know if it would ever feel whole again. The silence in my parents' house was suffocating after Greg left. My mom sat on the couch, her face buried in her hands, while my dad paced back and forth, his anger barely contained. Jessica stood by the door, arms crossed, her expression a mix of frustration and sadness. "I can't believe this," my mom finally whispered, her voice trembling. "How could Greg do something like this? To his own family?" "I don't know, Mom," Jessica said bitterly. "But he's gone now and good riddance." I wanted to agree, but the ache in my chest wouldn't let me. No matter how angry I was at Greg, the reality of what had happened still hurt. My family would never be the same. "Mark," my dad said, breaking me out of my thoughts. "What are you going to do about Emily?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. I looked at him, unsure of how to respond. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "She says she's sorry, but I don't know if I can trust her again." Jessica walked over and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Take your time, Mark. Don't let her pressure you into anything. This is your decision." I nodded, appreciating her support. But as I left my parents' house that night, the weight of everything felt heavier than ever. When I got home, the house was dark and quiet. Emily's absence was glaring, but for the first time, I welcomed it. I needed the space to think, to process what my next steps would be. As I sat in the dim light of the living room, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Emily. "Emily, Mark, I know I've hurt you, and I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Please don't give up on us." I stared at the message, my emotions swirling. Part of me wanted to respond, to hold onto the life we had built together. But another part, the part that felt betrayed and broken, couldn't bring itself to forgive her. I put the phone down without replying and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. For now, all I could do was try to get through one day at a time. The days that followed were filled with clarity. I had spent so long drowning in anger and heartbreak, but now, I finally felt like I was moving forward. Emily had made her choices, and so had I. The divorce was no longer a painful ending. It was the beginning of something new. Instead of focusing on what I had lost, I started focusing on myself. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in years, picked up old hobbies, and even started hitting the gym again. The pain was still there, but with each day, it felt a little lighter. Jessica checked in on me constantly, and my parents reminded me that no matter what, I wasn't alone. Their support helped more than I could ever express. One afternoon, as I sat in my favorite cafe, the same one where I had once taken Emily, I realized something. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't angry. I wasn't waiting for apologies or explanations. I was just living, and that, more than anything, was what mattered. A stranger sitting nearby caught my eye, giving me a polite smile before returning to her book. A small, simple moment, but it reminded me that life still had so much to offer. Emily's betrayal didn't define me. My past didn't define me. What mattered was what came next. As I finished my coffee and stepped outside, I took a deep breath, letting the crisp autumn air fill my lungs. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, I was excited to find out.